Thank you for watching Amish Eel 5858. I am Amir Budnam. I am thankful to all news resources. Following are the news reported by American, European, Asian, African channels. Asian African channels have reported the same news as the other channels. All news agencies also have same news. Netanyahu rejected U.S. terms and continued to attack Palestinians. U.S. leader Chuck Schumer talked tough against Israeli leader. Thousands protest in Russia against the election results. Putin has won the election with 82% majority. A killer from Pennsylvania has been arrested. Iceland experiencing a volcanic eruption. LGBT rights controversy. Ottawa killing 81-year-old man. Republican Party defend Trump controversial comments about the election's result. Trump doubling down on his comments. Meta made profit from illicit drug. Suspect arrested in Mexico. College student disappearance, spring break, winter back. Now the news in detail.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Russian President Vladimir Putin celebrates election results that will give him another 6 years in power, the vote coming after a brutal crackdown on anyone opposed to him or his war in Ukraine. With traditional protests deemed too dangerous, the opposition chooses a novel way to send a message of dissent, the widow of Alexei Navalny organising a surge of people to arrive at the polls in unison at noon. And ignoring international calls for restraint, the Israeli Prime Minister says his forces will soon enter Rafah, one of the last places of relative safety in the Gaza Strip, as his forces push ahead with their mission to eliminate Hamas. Those of you just joining us, welcome to the France 24 Newsroom. I'm Alexander Orkot. We begin with the Russian presidential election, where there were few surprises on Sunday. Projections give President Putin a comfortable landslide victory following a campaign where any real opposition candidate was either jailed, forced into exile, or worse. And any criticism of Putin or his war in Ukraine was quickly snuffed out. Well, for more details, we were earlier joined by Dan Hawkins, speaking to us from Moscow.
While the election results may have been rather predictable, just how quickly and how far the Kremlin's policies go next remains to be seen. Putin, of course, remains the leader of a country in conflict, not just with Ukraine, but as the Kremlin puts it, Russia in an existential struggle for survival against a hostile West, a hostile NATO. There's been a lot of talk from Putin about uniting society, mobilizing society for the war economy, and also giving those who've been involved in the so-called special military operation a special place, leading roles in society and the elite. So we could see some changes, perhaps, in the Kremlin's governance. He also wants to insulate the Russian economy and the standard of living for Russians against the consequences of sanctions and the conflict as well. He's spoken a lot about tackling poverty, increasing spending on infrastructure, and we hear this from a lot of politicians, of course, but Putin will be very keen to avoid a situation seen in the late Soviet Union, when a lack of consumer goods on the market caused a lot of discontent among people. He'll also want to shield the poorer Russians from the consequences who are bearing the financial burden, the burden in terms of people going to fight in the war, against what's going on. So in order to do that, there's been talk of raising taxes, of a progressive tax system. That's something really unheard of in modern Russia, which has a flat rate tax system. So you'll need to do that to raise revenue for the conflict, but at the same time to balance that with keeping businesses and business leaders on side. Mobilization will be a concern for a lot of Russians, of course, and officials are saying there's no plans to do that at all as of now. That's not being discussed. But the Kremlin does want a decisive breakthrough in Ukraine, and if Kiev decides to mobilize and to increase the amount of soldiers on the front, that could put pressure on Moscow to do the same. In terms of society, of course, Putin wants to develop this image of Russia as a bulwark of traditional conservative family social values. He'll want to develop Russia's image as a leader of the global south against Western hegemony. So in terms of foreign policy, we can see further alliances, further partnerships being built, not only within the BRICS nations, but beyond as well. So I think the next year to 18 months will give us a pretty good idea of what to expect from 6 more years of Putin in power, both domestically and in terms of international policy.
Now, staying with Russia and in a country where protesting can land you in prison, associates of the late opposition leader Alexei Navalny urged people to show their indignation by heading to the polls all at the same time. In several places, the queues did suddenly grow at noon on Sunday.
In an election that served up a landslide victory for President Vladimir Putin, some voters tried to flood polling stations with crowds at midday to denounce what they saw as a democratic charade. After supporters of the late political dissident Alexei Navalny called for a noon against Putin, the queues were a quiet show of dissent.
I came to this polling station because my friends and I planned to come together. I won't say specifically why we came, but as I already said, there's a unique spirit here, a unique atmosphere. I won't say why, but I think explaining it like this makes it clear.
The president's name appears on the ballot papers alongside 3 token challengers from Kremlin-friendly parties who have criticised neither Putin's rule nor the war in Ukraine. And after Alexei Navalny's suspicious death in the Siberian gulag last month, hundreds chose Sunday to lay flowers on the tomb of the president's main opponent.
Today is the 17th of March, the third and last day of the Russian presidential election, and that is why it is symbolic for me to come here to Navalny's grave.
But it is, of course, impossible to know how they voted. Alexei Navalny's wife cast her vote at the Russian embassy in Berlin, where she spoke to press afterwards.
You were probably wondering what I wrote on the ballot papers, who I voted for. Of course I wrote Navalny's name, because it just can't be that a month before the election, with the presidential campaign already underway, Putin's main opponent, already imprisoned, was murdered.
Calling the Russian president a gangster and a killer.
The UN chief Antonio Guterres has slammed Russia for holding votes in areas of Ukraine it has attempted to illegally annex, saying the ballots in these places have no validity under international law, a view shared by dozens of nations, as Charlotte Hughes explains.
Here in the town of Avdiivka in the Russian-occupied Donetsk region of Ukraine, these residents headed to the polls to vote in Russia's presidential elections. The vote took place under the supervision of heavily armed soldiers in the basement of a building destroyed by fighting before the city was captured by Russian forces in February. After more than 2 years of Russia's war in Ukraine, some voters said they were hopeful.
It's become calmer. Things have calmed down more or less. We're expecting good things.
A sentiment shared by some voters in the occupied Kherson region, some 600 kilometers west.
We're waiting for peace. We're waiting for things to get better, so that our children and grandchildren live in a free country that has prospects in everything.
Voting was organised in 4 occupied regions of Ukraine, which Russia claimed to annex in 2022: Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. It also took place in Crimea, which Russia illegally annexed in 2014. Kyiv called the ballot on occupied territories illegitimate.
The sham election process in the temporarily occupied territories is marked with intimidation and coercion of the local population. We therefore call on the international community to refrain from recognizing the results of these elections.
The UK Deputy Ambassador also denounced the move.
These elections are a sham because of a simple truth. You cannot hold legitimate elections in someone else's country. They will not be recognized, just as we will never recognize Russia's attempted annexation of Ukrainian territory.
More than 50 UN member states have condemned Russian efforts to carry out the election in occupied areas of Ukraine.
For a few more Western reactions before we move on, the White House saying the elections are obviously not free and fair, given how all political opponents have been prevented from running against Vladimir Putin. Foreign ministries of Germany, Britain and Poland all joined together in condemning the vote as illegitimate on X, formerly Twitter, and said the voting in annexed Ukrainian land is a breach of international law. Well, let's hear now from the Ukrainian president.
These days, the Russian dictator is imitating another election. It is clear to everyone in the world that this figure, as has happened so often in history, is simply sick from power, and is doing everything he can to rule forever. There is no evil he will not commit to prolong his personal power. And there is no one in the world who is immune to this. I thank every state, every leader, every international organization that has called and will continue to call these things by their proper names.
And now to some other world news. On the United States, South Korea and Japan have condemned the latest ballistic missile launches by North Korea that flew some 300 kilometers before landing in the East Sea. The firing occurred after the US and South Korea wrapped their joint annual military drills that continue to infuriate Pyongyang, and with the top US diplomat Antony Blinken currently in Seoul visiting for a democracy summit. The Japanese Prime Minister has called the missile launches absolutely unacceptable. South Korea called them a clear provocation. Now, 5 months of war in Gaza have sent thousands of Palestinians fleeing from their homes, with many pooling together in overcrowded conditions in the southern city of Rafah, near the Egyptian border. Despite international pressure to avoid civilian casualties and agree to a ceasefire, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu earlier told his cabinet they would soon be pushing into the last relatively safe place in the enclave.
Despite international calls to refrain from launching a ground offensive in Rafah, in southern Gaza, Benjamin Netanyahu has reiterated his determination to press ahead with the plan.
I say it again, we will break Rafah. It will take a few weeks, and it will happen.
Some 1.5 million Palestinians have sought refuge in Rafah, which is situated on the border with Egypt. Many are living in tents and makeshift housing in dire humanitarian conditions.
We have no other option but to come to the charity. We're from Gaza City. We have no money and we're living in tents. The charity is providing us with food.
Netanyahu said Israel would not leave civilians trapped in the area when the army launches its assault.
Our goal in eliminating the remaining terrorist battalions in Rafah goes hand in hand with enabling the civilian population to leave Rafah. It's not something that we will do while keeping the population locked in place.
Netanyahu's office says there are several Hamas battalions in Rafah and that Israel would need to send in troops to complete its goal of eliminating the organisation. The plan has come under heavy criticism from the international community, with the UN warning that a large-scale assault in the city could be disastrous. The President of the European Commission has also expressed concern about the planned ground invasion and has called for a rapid agreement on a ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas conflict.
Now, dozens of US citizens have touched down in Miami on the first charter flight out of Haiti. Earlier this month, the US Embassy in Port-au-Prince urged Americans to leave as soon as possible due to the security crisis. Armed gangs control around 80% of the capital city, and the main airport remains closed there. But the State Department announced on Saturday it would offer limited charter flights for American citizens from the less chaotic northern city of Cap Haitien, though the security situation is so bad that even getting there could be hazardous. The EU and Egypt have signed a controversial deal in Cairo, condemned by rights groups that criticise Egypt's human rights record. Flanked by the leaders of Belgium, Italy, Austria, Cyprus and Greece, the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, agreed to hand over €7.4 billion in aid to the cash-strapped North African nation, in part to stem the flow of migrants from the continent.
We already have a very good cooperation, and this is needed more than ever. This is why we will invest at least €200 million from today's package to make our cooperation even more effective. We will carry on with our work to facilitate legal migration, for example, the talent partnerships, And in parallel, we will continue to count on Egypt's full dedication to control illegal migration from border management to anti-smuggling and return.
Finally, people around the world have been celebrating St. Patrick's Day on Sunday. Among them, US President Joe Biden, proud of his own Irish heritage, of course, and keen for the votes from the diaspora in November. He hosted the Irish leader, or Taoiseach, as guest of honour for a special brunch at the White House. Around the world, the day was celebrated by Irish and non-Irish alike as another day for a bit of fun and revelry. Let's take a listen.
We have a really long history celebrating Ireland here in Tokyo. There's about 20 events around the country as well. So it's a culmination of a long history of good relations between Ireland and Japan.
We love the bagpipes. It's always been one of my favourite instruments to listen to. But just the festivities and the excitement, the pride that these people have.
Great to see Irish people worldwide being celebrated, especially in a city as big as New York. There's more people living in New York than there is in the whole of Ireland. So to come here and see this and see the celebration, it's great for us. It's a pride thing. It's great to see worldwide.
That's where we end this edition. Do stay tuned to Fast 24.
Hello and welcome to Talking Europe. My guest on this programme believes that the European Union has been too cautious for too long and has not proactively defined or defended its interests in the world. David McAllister is the chair of the European Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee, and he's the rapporteur of the report on implementing the EU's Common Foreign and Security Policy, or CFSP, which was adopted by MEPs in late February. It's an annual report, and this one is entitled Strengthening European Defence in a Volatile Geopolitical Landscape, which is obviously a central theme for the EU at the moment. Now, David McAllister is a German Christian Democrat, despite his name, and he's a vice president of the European People's Party here in the European Parliament.
On this Sunday night, remembering the victims of Ottawa's worst mass killing, the heart-wrenching tributes for the family and friend allegedly stabbed to death, including 4 young children.
Ashwini was a treasured member of our kindergarten class.
Russia's rigged election, the record turnout and polling station protests, with the results revealed. Plus, the strongest senior, the 81-year-old Winnipeg weightlifter, crushing records in his first competition.
It's truly inspiring to everyone.
Global National with Foreign Answer. Reporting tonight, Jeff Semple.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. We begin tonight in Ottawa, where more than 100 mourners gathered to remember 6 people killed this month inside their suburban home. The funeral service paid tribute to the Sri Lankan victims, a mother and her 4 young children, as well as a family friend. The father of the children, the only survivor of the attack, was also in attendance, still bearing the scars from the attack on March the 6th. In a written statement, he says he is devastated. Mackenzie Gray has our top story tonight.
Remembering the victims of the worst murders in modern Ottawa history. 2 adults, 4 children, the youngest just 2 months old, sharing a coffin with her mother.
Them not even having the experience of life and just dying for no reason, it's just heartbreaking.
The multi-faith ceremony, the first time the one surviving victim, Danushka Vikramasinghe, has been seen in public since his wife, 4 children, and family friend were allegedly murdered by 19-year-old Fabio De Souza, a Sri Lankan international student living with Vikramasinghe, who's now widowed. His family, in particular his young children, aged 7, 4, 2, and 2 months, remembered for their kindness and excitement.
Ashwini was a treasured member of our kindergarten class. Truly a friend to all. All her classmates wanted to sit beside her at circle time and have her join in play.
The other victim, Dominic Americoon, had just recently moved to Canada, now survived by his 2 daughters and wife. His 11-year-old spoke from Sri Lanka.
You're an amazing dad, and not only a dad, you're an amazing friend, and you're an amazing husband to Mommy, and that everyone here misses you a lot, and we're sorry that we weren't there when you needed it, and I hope you have a good time wherever you are.
The Vikramasinghe family overwhelmed by the support, including a crowdfunding campaign that raised over $200,000.
Your kindness has provided us with comfort and reassurance during this very difficult time.
That assistance coming from across the city, including from the local temple.
May all living beings be free from pain and grief. May all living beings be free from miseries. Buddhang saranang gacchami.
Aspirational words to live by, but ones that will likely take years for Danushka Vikramasinghe to feel, as he grieves the loss of his young family.
Sanghang saranang gacchami.
Mackenzie Gray, Global News, Ottawa.
Turning now to Israel's war with Hamas, more humanitarian aid has been airdropped into northern Gaza amid growing fears of an imminent Israeli ground offensive in Rafah. Jordan says it conducted 6 airdrops today alongside the US, Egypt, and Germany as talks to secure a ceasefire get set to resume in Qatar. Around 1.5 million people, that's half of Gaza's population, are sheltering in Rafah, and there are concerns that a military operation there will cause mass civilian casualties. But despite international pressure, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said today a ground offensive in the southern city will go ahead as planned. Well, the polls are now closed in Russia's first presidential election since that country's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and the results confirm expectations. Vladimir Putin has won a 5th term as president. The election commission in Moscow says Putin secured around 87% of votes counted so far. Putin's most prominent critic, Alexei Navalny, died in an Arctic penal colony 1 month ago. And today, his exiled wife, Yulia, called on voters to protest at the polls. Redmond Shannon reports on how Russians responded.
The official result was never in doubt. A huge win for Putin, even bigger than in 2018. The turnout higher too, according to the Election Commission. The three opponents who were approved to run broadly backed Kremlin policies, particularly on the war in Ukraine. In his victory speech, Putin thanked what he called Russia's warriors and said Russia cannot be suppressed when it's united, adding that the country's people are its source of power. The opposition movement for this election arguably sat in the hands of Yulia Navalny, who lined up to vote at the Russian embassy in Berlin. Her husband, jailed Putin critic Alexei Navalny, died in jail a month ago. She said she spoiled her vote by writing his name on the ballot. She thanked opponents of Putin for joining her call to line up at polling stations at exactly noon on Sunday. Longer lines were reported at noon in some locations in Russia. The Human Rights Monitoring Group said that at least 74 people were arrested. The 3 days of voting saw some instances of vandalism and high security at booths set up inside Russian-occupied Ukraine. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky called Putin's re-election illegitimate. Putin has accused Ukraine of election sabotage. On Sunday, a regional governor in southern Russia said Ukrainian airstrikes killed 2 people, including a teenage girl. And Russian exiled fighters allied with Ukraine claim to have taken control of a Russian border village. The war in Ukraine has been central to this election and will remain the focus of Putin as he starts his 5th term in office. A Moscow rally marking 10 years since the illegal annexation of Crimea is set for Monday. Redmond Channel Global News, London.
Global News has learned that another Canadian has been killed fighting in Ukraine. Jean-Francois Rattel from Quebec, also known as Rolf, was the leader of the Norman Brigade, made up of volunteer foreign fighters from Canada, the United States, Europe, and elsewhere. Rattel, a former member of the Canadian Armed Forces, was reportedly killed in a Russian attack in eastern Ukraine. He's one of at least 10 Canadians to be killed fighting in Ukraine since Russia launched its full-scale invasion 2 years ago. Well, for the 4th time since December, a volcano has erupted in Iceland, and this one is even more powerful than the others. Those sirens could be heard from the famous Blue Lagoon Spa, smoke and ash filling the night sky. Officials say the eruption began around 8 p.m. local time on Saturday, forcing thousands of tourists and residents to flee. Authorities declared a state of emergency and are monitoring lava flowing near a power plant, but the situation now appears to be stabilizing. In Western Canada, backcountry travelers are being urged to stay alert and avoid risky terrain as warm weekend temperatures trigger high risk for avalanches. Multiple regions in BC and Alberta are under warnings for very dangerous avalanche conditions. That includes popular destinations like Whistler and Banff. In BC, temperatures have soared to record highs this weekend, with some areas reaching up to 22 degrees. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre was in Halifax today, where hundreds turned out for a St. Patrick's Day rally. Poilievre continued his calls for the Trudeau government to axe the tax, a reference to the federal carbon pricing plan, which is set to increase next month. But how much will that actually cost Canadians? Heidi Petracek reports.
Every time someone yells, axe the tax, I have to take another sip.
It was standing room only on St. Patrick's Day.
We want people to bring home powerful paychecks, but they need homes to bring them to.
Pierre Poilievre railing against the federal government's upcoming increase on the carbon price and connecting it to the affordability crisis in what felt very much like a campaign event.
I think Mr. Poilievre is out for every seat, and he knows that Atlantic Canada is a place where he can make some gains, and so he's there. He's going to visit to try to make that happen.
High rents and rising food costs bringing these supporters out.
Well, we pay more at the end of the day, and a $1,500 one-time check is not going to cut it.
Just tired of paying too much tax, the way the economy in the country is now, and just believe in what he's saying and what he's doing.
The Prime Minister is staying the course on carbon pricing, even as 7 premiers and several provincial opposition leaders have urged a pause.
The idea of to make the free to pay and to provide an incentive for us to change our consumption away from the stuff with the big carbon footprint.
This economics professor doesn't think delaying or scrapping carbon pricing would help more Canadians make ends meet, and says it is necessary in the midst of a climate emergency.
Theoretically, they work, and they're meant to make things more expensive. They're meant to change relative prices. They're not responsible for the increase in inflation. They're not particularly responsible for the increase in food prices.
The Halifax stop was the final one on this East Coast tour for Pierre Poilievre. He has said he plans to take this issue to Parliament this week in several votes, calling on the federal Liberals to halt the April 1st increase, and he wants Liberal and NDP MPs to vote with him. Heidi Petracek, Global News, Halifax.
To avoid pain at the gas pumps, more than 350,000 Canadians have taken advantage of federal rebates to purchase electric or hybrid vehicles. But those programs that began back in 2007 are set to end next spring. And Trudeau's cabinet is now facing pressure to extend the rebates as part of an overhaul of Ottawa's electric vehicle strategy. David Aiken has the details.
The future behind the wheel is all electric, underwritten by thousands in federal and provincial rebates.
Proof's in the pudding. The two provinces with the highest incentives have the highest sales and sell 35% of the market in Canada.
The recent Quebec budget contained a measure to end that province's rebate program. Officials said it had simply become too expensive. This year, Ottawa could pay out as much as $600 million to buyers of electric and hybrid vehicles, and the federal program is not authorized to continue past March 2025.
It has accomplished a lot. I mean, if you look at the EV sales in 2023 versus 2022, they have increased by 32% year over year.
But Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland is expected to renew a modified incentive program, which he tables next year's budget on April the 16th. Among the changes considered, gearing rebates to household income or paying higher rebates to electric vehicles with a longer range.
Well, the more incentives we see on extended range batteries, I think the more people with range anxiety are more likely to get into the market.
Most MPs on the House of Commons Finance Committee think the Trudeau cabinet should do a complete overhaul of the government's entire EV strategy. Liberal, Bloc and NDP MPs have asked Freeland to consider a new green scrappage program to take carbon-emitting gas cars off the road.
We would like people to transition from gas to electric, or it can be a transit pass, it can be electric scooter, electric bike.
plug it in like that, and we're good to go. Some MPs also think the rebate program should be a fee-bate program. Cash back to buyers of electric vehicles, and those rebates paid for by extra fees or taxes on the gas guzzlers. MPs also say Ottawa needs to spend hundreds of millions more on high-speed charging infrastructure. Canada has just 27,000 EV chargers now, but will need 470,000 by 2035. Finally, the Trudeau cabinet is being asked to tell the civil service that when the federal government needs a new car, it better be electric. David Aiken, Global News, Ottawa.
Dogs in danger. Coming up, animal welfare groups in Manitoba declare a state of emergency. Dozens of animal rescue organizations have declared a state of emergency in Manitoba. They say they've reached a breaking point as animal populations grow out of control and stray dogs become more aggressive. As Melissa Ridgen reports, some advocates say it will take more than money to address the problem.
Wednesday! This work has no shortage of adorable, but it's not easy, traveling hundreds of kilometers to rescue animals, transport and care for them, and then find them all loving homes. Candace Cronin of Wild Willow Ranch and Rescue is one of 45 animal welfare groups declaring a state of emergency in Manitoba.
The rescues are drowning. There's no funding. Adoptions are low. We're at a crisis point.
Manitoba Underdogs is one of the province's largest rescues.
Right now we're in an intake freeze because we did have to stop, bringing in dogs, and that breaks our heart, and that's not something we ever want to have to do.
She says all rescues are in the same boat, as the dog population has grown out of control.
There's about 6 northern and remote communities that have announced cullings over the last 2 months, and that's due to dog attacks on other dogs and humans, and they don't have any alternative management programs available.
Rescues want the province to commit $2.5 million and a crackdown on backyard breeders. But Saskatchewan-based education and advocacy organization Save Res Dogs says money won't solve what's happening.
No, it's not just a Manitoba problem. It's really a First Nations community problem.
The relationship with dogs in many of them has to change.
Non-Native people, allies, I think they're really trying to be careful in how they navigate this. I can understand they are kind of being cautious because this is a very delicate issue.
She says the solution is respect and responsibility.
What I'd like to see is to get a resolution on animal welfare passed at the Assembly of First Nations level. That includes all the chiefs to be aware of it and to get involved.
Maslowski's hope is that more people demand change.
Use your voice. The dogs don't have a voice, unfortunately, and it's up to us to be able to bring awareness to this.
Melissa Ridgen, Global News, Winnipeg.
Still ahead, the politics of puberty blockers, the new controversial policy affecting transgender youth in England. Alberta's premier says a decision this week by British health officials is in line with her government's plans on transgender healthcare. Under a new policy, UK patients under the age of 18 will no longer be able to access puberty blockers unless they enroll in a clinical trial. That decision follows a 4-year review of published research, but critics say politics are at play. Heather Yertz-West explains.
When Justin Trudeau and Danielle Smith met face-to-face last Wednesday, Alberta's plan to limit healthcare access for transgender youth was among the topics discussed.
He did raise it, and I also raised the recent decision of the National Health Service to move forward with banning puberty blockers for youngsters. And I just said, look, we've got to follow the international evidence here.
Last week, England's National Health Service released a policy document advising that after reviewing the research, we have concluded that there is not enough evidence to support the safety or clinical effectiveness of puberty-suppressing hormones to make the treatment routinely available at this time. Transgender youth in the UK will still be able to access the therapy, but only as part of clinical research trials.
Not surprising at all. Certainly, there's been a strong anti-trans movement in the UK and particularly within the government.
Questions around how best to care for transgender youth have become a contentious issue in England. Its central gender clinic is slated to be shut down, with treatment to be offered out of regional centres moving forward instead. The country's Conservative Prime Minister has also not been shy about sharing transphobic views.
We shouldn't get bullied into believing that people can be any sex they want to be. They can't. A man is a man and a woman is a woman. That's just common sense.
Last month, Alberta's premier rolled out a suite of proposed parental rights policies that included a ban on puberty-blocking therapy for children under 16. But Canada's medical community is not on side. A day after the NHS England decision, 13 Canadian medical associations posted a joint statement online. There is no one-size-fits-all approach for patients experiencing gender dysphoria. Restricting choices and appropriate care for patients can lead to permanent harm. A strong statement in an increasingly heated debate, growing more divisive by the day. Heather Yertz-West, Global News, Calgary.
Raising the bar. Next, the senior powerlifter breaking records at a Winnipeg competition.
You've got the best deals on delicious food. Order now.
Food Panda! Food Panda!
Welcome back. You often hear that you're never too old to exercise, and one senior in Winnipeg is taking that notion to new heights. The 81-year-old took part in his first weightlifting competition this weekend, and not only did he crush it, he also powered his way into the record books. Catherine Dornian has his story.
It's Ron Brunner's first ever weightlifting competition.
I started working out, and they asked me if I was interested into competing, and I said, I sure am.
And he's starting off strong.
You want to know, I'm 81 years old, and I feel like 61 years old.
About 6 months ago, he got into powerlifting at Winnipeg's One Family Fitness Center. From there, he was ready to take on the next challenge, competing in the One Powerlifting Classic. Kyla Kamari, his coach and owner of the gym, says he's made amazing progress.
When he came to us, he couldn't even sit and get up. And now, he's doing a powerlifting competition. So being the oldest at the competition, it's truly inspiring to everyone.
Competing solo in his category, the medal was his, but he didn't choose the lightweight out, challenging himself to break provincial records and lifting a final weight of 32.5 kilograms. And his friends, family, and neighbors couldn't be prouder. A busload of his fellow residents and staff at Riverwood Square Retirement Living came out to cheer him on.
I made signs with my residents. We were so excited. We got a bus together, and it feels empowering. It's inspiring. Ron being 81 years old, it just shows you anybody can do this.
And while Ron may have come late to the weightlifting game, he says he's in it for the long haul.
It's something new to me, but I'm not going to give it up. I'll be back again next year.
Lifting his crowd of adoring fans along for the ride too. Catherine Dornian, Global News, Winnipeg.
Inspiring stuff, though. I bet he's going to be sore tomorrow. That is Global National for this Sunday night. I'm Jeff Semple. Tonight's Your Canada. You can probably guess Canada's biggest St. Patrick's Day parades in Toronto and Montreal. We hope you'll be able to get your green on with family and friends tonight. Thanks for watching. Nifu Garcha will be with you at the anchor desk tomorrow. Happy St. Patrick's.
Tonight on PBS News Weekend, with hundreds of thousands of Americans relying on Catholic hospitals, why some people are facing barriers to reproductive health care. Then concerns over declining support for LGBTQ+ rights, reversing years of increasing support.
And I think what's happening is that you see many Republican leaders in red states really trying to amp up the volume, so to speak, on LGBTQ rights and really trying to claw back some of those rights across the country.
And for our Hidden History series, how pioneering chemist Stephanie Kwolek followed her passion and invented a revolutionary fiber with widespread applications. Major funding for PBS News Weekend has been provided by
Consumer Cellular. This is Sam. How may I help you? This is Pocket Dial. Well, somebody's pocket. Thought I'd let you know that with Consumer Cellular, you get nationwide coverage with no contract. That's kind of our thing. Have a nice day.
and with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. And friends of the News Hour. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. Good evening, I'm John Yang. Today, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu dismissed growing U.S. criticism of his leadership, his prosecution of the war with Hamas, and his plans for a military ground operation in Rafah. Netanyahu said international pressure would not deter him from carrying out the assault on Rafah and pressing for total victory. The Prime Minister approved plans for the operation late last week after meeting with his war cabinet. It comes as President Biden says the high death toll from fighting in Gaza is hurting Israel, and as Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, the top-ranking Jewish U.S. official and a strong supporter of Israel, said Netanyahu has lost his way and said there should be new Israeli elections. Today on CNN State of the Union, Netanyahu fired back.
I think what he said is totally inappropriate. It's inappropriate for to go to a sister democracy and try to replace the elected leadership there. That's something that Israeli public does on its own, and we're not a banana republic.
Talks in search of an agreement for a pause in fighting, the release of Israeli hostages from Gaza, and of Palestinian prisoners from Israel are set to resume soon in Qatar. In Russia, polls have closed after 3 days of voting. An early return shows President Vladimir Putin with nearly 88% of the vote as he seeks a fifth six-year term. Earlier, anti-Kremlin demonstrators lined up outside polling places at noon, the hour set by supporters of the late opposition leader Alexei Navalny for a mass protest. Meanwhile, Ukraine launched a series of drone attacks in the Moscow region and beyond. Shelling in the Russian border city of Belgorod killed at least 2 people and injured a dozen more. 26-year-old man has been charged with murder in Pennsylvania and carjacking and weapons violations in New Jersey in connection with yesterday's shooting deaths of 3 members of the man's family in 2 different locations. His capture yesterday ended an hours-long standoff with police at a Trenton, New Jersey home. The manhunt shut down a St. Patrick's Day parade, an amusement park, and led to a shelter-in-place order. Police said the shootings were the result of a domestic situation. And there's been another volcano eruption in southern Iceland, prompting evacuations and a declaration of a state of emergency. It's the latest in a series of eruptions since December. A glowing 2-mile fissure has sent lava onto major roads. A nearby small town and popular geothermal spa were evacuated following the eruption. Officials say barriers protecting residential areas are holding for now. Still to come on PBS News Weekend, what's behind the decline of support for LGBTQ+ rights, and the life, career, and achievements of scientist and chemist Stephanie Kwolek. This is PBS News Weekend from WETA Studios in Washington, home of the PBS News Hour, weeknights on PBS. Every year, more than 3.6 million babies are born in the United States. And according to KFF Health News, more than 500,000 of them, or about 16%, are delivered in Catholic-run hospitals. In most cases, there are no complications and the birth is much like one in any hospital. But if there's an emergency, pregnant people can find themselves caught between accepted medical standards and the religious-based policies of Catholic-run facilities. KFF Health News found that for nearly 800,000 Americans, there's little choice. They have only Catholic or Catholic-affiliated birth hospitals within an hour's drive. KFF Health News reporter Rachana Pradhan is one of the writers of the story, which is the product of almost 2 years of reporting. Rachana, you talked to a lot of women who had complications while being treated in Catholic-run hospitals. What did they tell you, and is there a story, one particular story that's sort of emblematic to you?
Absolutely, John. And I'll say that in particular, talking to clinicians like physicians, nurse practitioners, and other medical clinicians that treat patients in these hospitals really were the ones that shared incredible stories with us. One in particular involves a nurse midwife who spoke with me who used to do deliveries at a Catholic hospital in Maryland. She encountered a woman who showed up at this hospital because her water had broken before her fetus was viable, so the baby would not survive outside of the womb. And what she told us was this patient expressed a desire to terminate the pregnancy because she knew that there was little chance of survival. And what happened was, as this nurse midwife told us, the doctor said that they couldn't do anything because there were still detectable fetal heart tones, and so their hands were totally tied. That is not often what would happen in a non-Catholic hospital and goes against accepted medical standards for treating that kind of pregnancy complication.
What are some of the sort of the range of medical choices that clinicians and healthcare providers would want to make or have wanted to make at a Catholic-run hospital but have not been allowed to because of the hospital's policies?
I think in particular, what we found based on talking to clinicians, reading research, and also talking to patients are that these very fraught and difficult situations in which someone's pregnancy goes awry, in which a complication happens that's quite serious and could obviously threaten the viability of that baby. In situations like that, these ethical and religious directives that apply to Catholic healthcare facilities, essentially what they say is that these hospitals are prohibited or limited in doing certain procedures that the Catholic Church finds to be immoral. So overarchingly, what this can affect is care during pregnancy complications. It can affect birth control, the availability of birth control at these facilities. And in situations like the one I just talked about, it means that the pregnancy terminations may not be offered because these Catholic healthcare standards, the baby is still alive. And so that would constitute an abortion, and they are obviously opposed to abortions.
Do these hospitals have any policies on referrals to other facilities that might be able to do those things?
Yes, so the Catholic health directives do address referrals, and this doesn't only apply to pregnancy terminations, but other types of care too, namely procedures that can prevent pregnancy. So both for men and women, frankly, vasectomies, or let's say a woman who wants to get her fallopian tubes removed because she does not want to have any more children. They're also restricted from making referrals because in the eyes of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, which is the organization that crafts these directives, and the Church, a physician referring for a procedure or care that they have deemed immoral, that also goes too far. And so it can limit the ability for a patient to receive care at another facility, or at the very least, they have to take it much more upon themselves to figure out where they might be able to go because the Catholic healthcare facility cannot get so involved.
Do the church leaders like the diocesan archbishops, do they have a role in the medical policies of hospitals?
So the ethical and religious directives are really broad guidelines. And what we learned is that depending on a particular bishop of a particular diocese, sometimes policies will apply more strictly in certain places than others. And so I think that's actually, at least based on the conversations we've had with clinicians, I think that's actually part of the frustration, is that these things are not black and white, and they can change depending on who essentially is in charge. And the bishops obviously have a role in this. They're not, based on what we learned, they're not the ones who are making these difficult calls in certain situations to provide healthcare, but they are responsible for overseeing enforcement of the directives broadly.
What do Catholic hospitals say, or how did they respond or reacted to your reporting?
Well, the Catholic Health Association, who we spoke with for our story before it published, they say that the ERDs, as they are known, do not prevent physicians from providing medically indicated care, especially in these situations involving very serious, potentially life-threatening pregnancy complications. And they also took issue with our story after it came out. They released a statement that said that it perpetuates myths about Catholic healthcare. I will say that we stand by our reporting. As you noted, we worked on this for nearly 2 years and talked to many, many, many people, including patients, doctors, nurse practitioners, midwives, and others who have really studied this field a lot and could very clearly state what the impacts are on patients.
For women who feel that they were not treated properly or didn't receive the proper medical treatment at these hospitals, is there any legal recourse for them?
So broadly speaking, most of the states in the country we found have liability shields for hospitals when they refuse to perform certain types of care because of moral or religious objection. And those laws exist all over the U.S., and they apply to at least some hospitals in not every state, but really the vast majority. For other types of medicine, for a whole host of procedures, you could potentially take up a medical malpractice case against an individual provider or a hospital. But in these situations, basically what state law says in these states is that the hospitals are shielded from being held liable in these types of situations.
Rachana Pradhan of KFF Health News, thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for having me.
For the last few decades, the story of LGBTQ+ rights in America has been one of increasing public support. But now a new survey finds that for the first time in years, there's a slight decline in that support. William Brangham takes a closer look.
Throughout 2023, the Public Religion Research Institute, or PRRI, interviewed over 22,000 adults for what it calls its American Values Atlas. Last week, the organization released its findings on views about LGBTQ rights in the U.S. The survey showed, for the first time, support fell for key policies regarding LGBTQ rights. Backing for same-sex marriage dropped 2 percentage points. Support for non-discrimination protections dropped 4 points. And opposition to people refusing services based on religious grounds dropped 5 points. To help us understand this data, we are joined by CEO of PRRI, Melissa Deckman. You have been doing this survey for years, and this being the first time you've seen a downward tick in those numbers, how do you explain that?
Yeah, we were somewhat surprised to see after several years of increasing support among Americans for LGBT rights that we saw a decline. But I think if you look under the hood, so to speak, and look at the data more closely, it's really largely driven by party polarization. And so we saw much deeper declines, for example, among Republicans in terms of their support for these issues, whereas the Democrats tended to stay relatively stable. And I think what's happening is that you see many Republican leaders in red states really trying to amp up the volume, so to speak, on LGBTQ rights and really trying to claw back some of those rights across the country. And I think that's had a spillover effect nationally in terms of the attitudes of Republicans especially on issues with respect to LGBTQ rights.
In your survey, you're talking to people who both affiliate with a particular religion and also non-religious people as well, correct?
That's right. So our surveys are done among Americans nationally. One great thing about the ABA is we also have enough data to look at opinions in all 50 states. But essentially, we get a snapshot of all Americans, including people of faith and people who are unaffiliated. I think it's also important to bear in mind that despite these declines that we've seen, the vast majority of people of faith continue to support the rights of LGBT Americans, especially with respect to same-sex marriage and non-discrimination laws.
So for someone who might look at this and think, oh, a 2% decline or a 5% decline is not that substantial, why does this really stand out to you?
I think it stands out because with respect to LGBT rights more generally, there has been a growing increase in support among Americans. And part of that is a reflection of the fact that more Americans, especially younger Americans, are identifying as LGBTQ. So younger Americans, more Americans have friends who are LGBTQ, they themselves are LGBTQ, they have colleagues. So there has been this assumption that as we become more, I think, accepting of LGBTQ Americans in our daily lives, that it would just naturally lend itself to people being more supportive of protecting the rights of LGBTQ Americans. But I think this data shows you that that's not necessarily an assumption that is true. And so it's something important to monitor and keep aware of.
I mean, is it perhaps also possible that as people start to identify more publicly and assert their rights and take a more prominent place in society, that we could be seeing the traces of a backlash here?
I think that's exactly what you're seeing. One of the things that we analyze in the report is we look at the relationship between Christian nationalist views and support for LGBT rights. As you might imagine, Americans who have a tendency to support Christian nationalism are far less likely to support the rights of LGBT Americans, in part because of the theological opposition to the idea of really homosexuality and being queer to begin with. And so I think that there's that important relationship there that we have to really keep in mind.
Can you talk about, are there other below the top lines here, other data points that were of interest to you?
We were really surprised in our findings that younger Americans have trended downward with respect to support for LGBTQ rights. If you look at our data, we find that roughly 1 in 5 Americans aged 18 to 29 identify as LGBTQ. But yet what's happened over the past couple of years is that there's been a slight decline among younger Americans. I think the assumption was that because younger Americans are more likely to identify as queer, that we'd always have younger Americans being more supportive. Again, though, you have to look under the hood. It's really party polarization that is driving down support among younger Americans for same-sex marriage, for example. So one number really stands out to us. If you look at young Americans' attitudes about same-sex marriage, in 2020 among Republicans, 2/3 supported same-sex marriage rights. But in last year's data among young Republicans aged 18 to 29, it's less than half. That's a really big cratering of support. I think there was often an assumption among many political analysts that younger Republicans would moderate the party with respect to things like LGBTQ rights or even abortion rights or climate change, etc. But what we're finding in this data is that younger Republicans are very conservative socially.
So interesting. For people who are LGBTQ or work to help solidify their rights, what does the survey data tell you about what work lies ahead for them?
Well, I think the survey data really points, as we like to say, the canary in the coal mine idea that you can't assume that such rights are going to be held in perpetuity or will increase. And you can't also assume just because the vast majority of Americans support these rights that those rights are going to be legally protected, especially in wake of the Dobbs decision. There's now a conservative majority on the Supreme Court, and there's indication that the rights of same-sex marriage are going to be on the line. You're going to have legal challenges from conservative groups who are going to be fighting to roll back those rights. And I think that this is just a good reminder that those rights shouldn't be taken for granted, that it's going to take political organizing, and that elections have consequences.
All right, that is the CEO of PRRI, Melissa Deckman. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
The fiber Kevlar is stronger than steel, and it's revolutionized everything from body armor for the military and police to sports equipment. Its inventor is the subject of tonight's Hidden Histories for Women's History Month. Here's Ali Rogan.
Skis, brake pads, racing sails, spacesuits,
I think this is just a fantastic looking suit.
and perhaps most famously, the bulletproof vest. These products and many others are made with Kevlar, a strong, lightweight fiber invented by researcher Stephanie Kwolek in 1965. It all began when DuPont Chemicals asked researchers to make a fiber that could withstand extreme conditions.
The solution was very, very fluid. I mean, it was almost like had the consistency of water.
Synthetic fibers start in liquid form and are spun into a strand.
So when I asked the technologist to help me with the spinning, he refused because he said, this will never spin. It's too fluid. It probably has particulate matter in it because it's cloudy and so forth.
But Kwolek was convinced it would work and persuaded him to give it a try.
Well, the results came back and they were sort of unbelievable.
The fiber was lightweight, heat resistant, and 5 times stronger than steel.
There, of course, was immediate excitement because everybody realized the potential of this discovery.
But Kwolek did not set out to become an inventor. Growing up outside Pittsburgh, she considered fashion, inspired by her mother, who sewed. Later, as a bright student, she thought about teaching. By the time she started college in the midst of World War II, she was determined to go to medical school. She chose to major in chemistry at Carnegie Tech, now called Carnegie Mellon University. But when she graduated, her plans changed again.
Since I could not afford to go to medical school at that time, I had to go out and seek employment.
She got several job offers, but one stood out for its interesting work and for paying men and women the same starting wage.
And so I took the job with the DuPont company. The only problem was that I became so enamored of the work that I totally lost interest in medical school.
When she started, DuPont's research laboratory was in the middle of a race to discover fibers that would revolutionize not just fashion, but war and space travel.
Miss Gloria Glamour thrills to the ultimate in hosiery.
Just a few years earlier, the company had created the first synthetic fiber, nylon.
No baggy knees or deforming wrinkles during the life of a nylon stocking.
That fiber success and wartime rationing of natural materials like silk and rubber set off an intense competition between companies like DuPont and Monsanto.
There was tremendous interest in new fibers and new ways to make fibers.
Over the next 2 decades, the group created the methods and techniques that would be used to make spandex,
One small step for man,
new polyester and acrylic fabrics,
these curtains are made of Dacron polyester fibers,
and the flame-resistant Nomex. But there was another, stiffer, stronger fiber waiting to be discovered, Kevlar. In 1964, Qualic's research group was tasked with finding a fiber to make durable, lightweight tires to improve fuel efficiency in cars.
It got to be a race, but it was a very, very secretive race, so that very few people outside of our laboratory knew what was going on. But it still was a lot of fun, particularly if you won.
And they did. Qualic cracked the problem in 1965, discovering a version of the polymer that could be spun up into a fiber. Fiber B, as it was known internally, became Kevlar, the basis for a whole family of products. Qualic spent the rest of her career at DuPont. She mentored other women in her field and worked to introduce young people to science, writing letters and giving lectures.
I really did not think of the bulletproof vest. We had Dr. Joe Rivers, who at that time was already looking for fibers to use in making bulletproof vests. And I remember the very first time that I spun the 14B that he came over and he said, if you can possibly spare a tiny bit of that fiber, I would like to test it and see if it'll be useful in a bulletproof vest.
She was named on a total of 28 patents and won several awards for her work, including the National Medal of Technology. Qualic was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame in 1995. At the time, she was only the 4th female inductee. But to Qualic, her crowning achievement was making Kevlar possible.
I was fortunate enough to do something that would be of benefit to mankind. It's been an extremely satisfying discovery. I don't think there's anything like saving someone's life to bring you satisfaction and happiness.
Qualic died in 2014 at the age of 90, but her greatest invention is still saving lives today. For PBS News Weekend, I'm Ali Rogan.
On the PBS NewsHour Instagram right now, hear what Oklahoma State Representative Maury Turner had to say to more than 100 students and LGBTQ plus supporters following the death of a 16-year-old transgender student. All that and more is on our NewsHour Instagram. And that is PBS News Weekend for this Sunday. On Monday, the latest in our series, America's Safety Net, examines the challenges millions of Americans face getting housing choice vouchers. I'm John Yang. For all of my colleagues, thanks for joining us. Have a good week.
Major funding for PBS News Weekend has been provided by, and with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. You're watching PBS.
Good evening, I'm William Brang. I'm on.
Thank you for watching and privilege of your time. This is Amish Skill 5858. I am Ahmed Goodnam.
Have a good life.